for me, not so good news for you. The projectors aren't working, which is like my dream come true, that people actually have to open up a Bible and touch paper. So this is like the perfect excuse. So hopefully, if you have your Bible, great. If not, maybe you can pull out your phone and follow along. God willing, we're going to finish up the rest of chapter 2 today, and then hopefully we'll be able to cover chapter 3, 4, and 5 the weeks after. Just the chapters have been a bit long, so we didn't want to go over the time. But God willing, after today, we'll be able to finish a chapter a week, and we'll kind of get through the first epistle to Peter. All right, last week, who knows what we covered last week? Who can kind of look? You can cheat, but maybe you can kind of figure out what it is that St. Peter was talking about in the first epistle, chapter 2. So we did the second half of chapter 1, and then the first 10 verses of chapter 2. Anyone remember what happened last week? St. Peter gave them like an identity. What was their identity? Okay, newborn babies, very good. Okay, love one another fervently with one in a heart. That was the identity of the church, that people would love each other fervently. Okay, very good. Look at chapter 2, verse 9. Chapter 2, verse 9. He says what? Okay, very good. You're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. Who did God previously say those same words to before? So these are Gentile people who converted into the faith, and they were always estranged, and they could never consider themselves, number one, they lived very, very, very evil, sinful lives. I mean, they came from very sinful backgrounds. And then you see that St. Peter is saying, wait a second, the same title that God gave to the special people of Israel is exactly what he told them. You see that reference in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. When he was telling them, look, you guys are going to be special. You guys are a chosen people, or a chosen generation, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, and my own special people. Now, we're going to get into chapter 2, verses 11 to 25, but we're going to read just from 11 to 17. It says, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So here, St. Peter is trying to tell the people, says, look, I've told you who you are. We've been talking about the spiritual inheritance that is kept for you on the end, at the end of this life. You have this great inheritance kept for you, and because God has given you a special identity, you're not just any people. You can't just, okay, now we're just Christians. It's just like a religion. We just join a religion. We have our routines. We have our rituals. We do our prayers. No. He's giving them an identity. You are the special people of the Creator of heaven and earth. You people, you Gentile Christians, are the ones that are going to be God's own special people. Obviously, he's not just referring to the Gentiles. He's saying the Jews and the Gentiles. But it meant so much more to a Gentile who could never be a Jew. The Jews, they had the monopoly on being the God's people. That's it. They were the ones, and nobody else could do it. And so here, you have him paving the identity. So he says, because of that, look at the tone of St. Peter. You hear like a gentleness and a plea to the believers. Again, I told you St. Peter's personality before, he was very impulsive. He says things out of line. He's like, doesn't think before he talks. He's very sometimes like abrasive. The gentle one of the disciples was who? Who was the gentle one? St. John. St. John was the one that used to lay his head on the chest of the Lord, and he was very like loving. He used to say, the one whom the Lord loves. He had this very intimate relationship with Christ. But what you see is, again, what we're seeing is that because St. Peter was practicing everything that he's talking about, he's experienced the power in everything that he's talking about, you see just a transformation in the character of Peter. He says, beloved, I beg you. St. Peter was known to be like the oldest among the apostles. He was the authority in the church. Imagine, he's like, he's a patriarch. He's the oldest among the apostles. He's the most respected. He was one of the intimate of the Lord. He says, I beg you. My beloved, I beg you. So when St. Peter is begging us to do something, the one that was like one of the best friends of Christ and had this deep, rich experience, you have to listen to what it is that he is paving. So I want you guys to look at your Bibles. He says, beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. You see, what he's saying is, because of your identity, you have to lead a blameless life. Because look, you are living among a people that hate you. You are living among a people that think, number one, so they're persecuting the Christians, like we said. They're dragging them in the streets. They're lighting the Christians on fire. They were doing all kinds. So it says, look, I beg you, don't forget your identity. And because you're hated, they are looking for mistakes in you. They are looking for something to criticize about you people, this sect of the Jews. They thought that the Christians were this like new sect of the Jews, or this new denomination of the Jews. And so when they looked at them, everybody hated Jews. And so when they saw these Christians, they said, okay, like another type of Jew. And because they were the ones that Nero blamed for burning down the city of Rome, they were just hated. They were taught to hate everybody. They were taught to hate the Christians. So he says, be careful. People are looking to nitpick at you. I want to ask you today, how do people in the United States and in Canada look at Christians today? What is the viewpoint when people in America think of Christians? What do they think of? Do they think of like, wow, these are a blessed people? These are a people that are the own special people of God. They are something different. Today in America, like, we are mocked on every level. Anybody ever watch Saturday Night Live? Like, Saturday Night Live is just a mockery of like priests and nuns, and like everything that you see in our culture today is looking at Christians. But when they think of Christians, do they think of them in a highlight as like untouchable people? Like people that are just, they're unique, they're different. Look at what he says. We're going to get into that real quick. First of all, he says, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. When you think of fleshly lusts, what do you think of? When you think of fleshly lusts, what comes to mind? Come on. We know what I'm talking about, right? Huh? Adultery, sexual sins. But in the Bible, fleshly lusts means a lot more than just the sexual sin. It meant all of the appetites of this sinful nature. It's the nature that is functioning apart from God. I'll give you one example that is a fleshly lust. Division. When you think of, St. Paul says, I desire to give you milk. But it says, I desire to give you the pure milk of the word, but because you are carnal, he says, because you are carnal, I couldn't give you, I decided to give you meat, but because you are carnal, I could only give you milk. You know what he's saying? He says, because there are dissensions among you. St. Paul is telling the people of Corinth. He says, the reason why I can't give you more spiritual teachings is because you're carnal. You are fleshly people. What kind of fleshly people? People that have arguments. I want you to think, I think sometimes we categorized our carnal, fleshly lust that, you might read here at face value and think, okay, he's talking about sexual sins. That's one of them. But the other one is gluttony. How many of you have tasted a bit of gluttony in the last for 35 days in this holy 50 days. Maybe you've eaten 4 times a day and you've eaten twice as much you've ever eaten, in the last 4 months or something, because what? We are carnal people. We love these to fulfill these fleshly lusts. Ease and luxury. When you think of these carnal lusts, do you think of ease, living in a life of comfort and luxury? That's carnal. That's what he's considering as a carnal life. He goes on, he says, you find this in Galatians 5, which Abuna Anthony, which we covered with Abuna Anthony. Jealousy, envy, hatred, quarrels. You might think, well, I'm not like these heathen people who are living in the fleshly lusts, the sinful sexual lusts. I might have a tiff here and there. I might have a division between me and my whatever co-workers, or whatever it may be. You might feel like a division isn't a big deal, but the fleshly lusts are the big deal. St. Paul puts them in the same category, and so does St. Peter. And he goes on and he says, these need to be regulated, your desires within you. Anybody here not have desires? Raise your hand if you don't have desires. If you do, come see me after. There's something unhealthy about you. Okay? God has given you desires. God has given our bodies desires, but these desires are meant to be governed by the will of God, to be protected and to be practiced within the will of God. Then he says what? These are warring against you. So the Greek word that he's talking about, when he says that they war against the soul, he's saying it's the idea of an army that marches against a city. When he says that these fleshly lusts which war against your soul, how many of us can relate to that? Sometimes we feel that these impulses, these desires, these passions within us, it seems like it's almost like an army that is attacking a city. I come and I see, how would you feel if you saw just, an army of men attacking the church? You would feel like, how can I bear this? But St. Peter's trying to let them know by their identity, because of who you are, you can overcome these desires. You can overcome these fleshly lusts which fight against your soul. When you think about fleshly lusts, you feel like they affect your body, right? You feel like when you eat too much, makes you unhealthy. Sexual, sins that we get in can affect us physically. But what else? The fleshly sins that we might be in, come in contact with, they affect our inner life. How many of us have felt like a depleting of an inner strength? Like our inner strength is just lost. I don't have the power to fight anymore because I keep on engaging in these wars. I keep on falling in these wars. They attack these impulses within us. They attack and conquer us. We feel like they give us this numbness. You might find that you've tolerated a sin in your life, and in the beginning you felt terrible. And then, I feel bad. And then, what's the big deal? And you become numb. Do you know what leprosy is? Leprosy is not just a skin disease, but leprosy is when you become so numb that you have no feeling in you, that you begin to injure yourself and not even know that you're injured. Like, leprosy is a very dangerous thing, but it's not just a skin disease. It's a numbness. And so St. Peter's saying, look, if you're going to become numb in the middle of all these temptations as a Christian, it's dangerous for you. It's going to be too hard for you as a Christian if you end up becoming numb and tolerant of the sins that are fighting against us. I have a question. Does every sin, what do you guys think? Does every sin have a physical consequence? Does every fleshly lust have a physical consequence? What do you think? Every single one? I mean, have any of us gotten away with sins before? Like, you've sinned, you've confessed, nothing happened. I think I have. Okay, not everything has a physical consequence. The potential of it is to have a physical consequence is very high. There is a potential to suffer a physical consequence. But deeper than that, your soul becomes so wounded, so bereft of God's strength. You become so unable to fight anymore the more that we engage with sin. So, for example, if you are living in gluttony, you eat too much. You eat all the time, and you eat all the time, and you're always... The fathers of the church say that the root of lustful sins, like sexual lustful sins, is actually tied to eating. And when they talk about this ladder of spirituality, they say that the root of lustful sins is eating. And so, when you eat and you gratify your body, you can gain weight, you can become unhealthy, but even like sexual sins, it's not always going to be that there's going to be a physical consequence. Is there potential? Of course there is. But what's even worse than that, and what is much harder to restore, is our souls. Like you can get away, you might think that you got away with stealing. Maybe you stole something. I used to work at a bank when I was younger, and I remember I got robbed actually one time. There was a guy, I'm counting my money, and there's a guy standing literally on my desk. He's like standing holding a gun. And he like jumped and he took the money, and I pressed the button, we called the police. Hey, he's free, and he took a lot of money, and he never got caught, okay? And I'm thinking, he never got caught. But I promise you, deep within, in his soul, he's going to deal with a lot more than just the physical consequence of getting arrested or having to give the money back. Or it's not always that it's going to be an equal like tit for tat. It's not always going to happen that way. But you have to know that it's going to affect your soul. And your being is your soul. Who cares about the flesh? Your whole identity, like Abuna Paul, it's not my body, it's my person. The person of Abuna Paul becomes affected. He becomes weaker. He becomes unable to kind of... Look at Samson. Samson is the perfect example. Samson was toying with his consecration. No one was supposed to touch his hair. He allowed Delilah to play with his hair. He was touching camel skin like ropes, which are illegal. He wasn't allowed to touch dead animals. Slowly, Samson was overtaken. Even though Samson could take down an army by himself, what happened? He was overtaken, and he lost his inner strength. His soul, the power that was within, was lost. It wasn't just his physical body. His muscles didn't change, but it was the inner power that was depleted when he gave up and started to work with what? And play with sin. Be careful. Look at Samson. Samson is the best example that he thought he was getting away with everything, and he was still, even though he married a harlot, he did many things, and people would come and try to overtake him in the room, and he would beat them up like 10 men at a time, even though he was toying with physical sin. He had other sins, and he still had this power. But eventually, when his hair was cut, and he started to become numb towards this holy calling of his, he lost the inner power. And so Samson, only until the end of his life, was able that God would restore it. So he says, why should you war against the soul? Because you're a stranger. Because you're a foreigner and a pilgrim. You're from somewhere else, and that's why you need to. He says, when you live in a different country, you stick out. Anybody ever go to, like if you were born and raised in America and you go to Egypt, you might look Egyptian, you might dress, if you probably don't dress, but when you go there, you stick out like a sore thumb. They know your accent. I'll never forget this. One time, I was taking a taxi, and I thought my Arabic was pretty good. So I get in a taxi, I sit in the front. First thing I do, I reach for the seatbelt. Khalas, that's it. This guy's gonna... So my friend in the back is holding the seatbelt. So I'm pulling, and he's holding the seatbelt. I'm pulling the seat. I'm like, what's wrong with you? I'm going crazy. Why are you holding my seatbelt? And he's trying to say basically, we don't wear seatbelts in Egypt, remember? We don't wear seatbelts in the taxi. So clearly I got ripped off. Why? Because they know I stick out. When St. Peter tells you that you are a sojourner, do you stick out? Do you feel not at home in your schools, your places of work? Do you feel like, I just don't belong? Or are you just like everybody else? We socialize the same way, we spend our money the same way, we spend our time the same way, we do everything that everybody does the same way. St. Peter's saying, no, remember that you are a sojourner. You're supposed to stick out. Like, you can't go, like again, you can't walk down the street in Egypt without sticking out, knowing that like, this person's not from here. Right? They look different, they talk different, they're just not, you might speak the language perfectly, but you're just not from here. That's the same thing with us. St. Peter's saying your identity should show by the way that you conduct your life. So he says what? Having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, so the people are looking at the Christians, they're saying these people are the worst. Do you know what the other religion in Egypt speaks about Christians when they say that the liturgy is a love feast? They think it's something like very sinful. They think that all types of wicked things are happening in that church with the Christians. But when they say that, and then you meet with a Christian at work, and you see how they are like with their neighbors, and you see how they are and how polite they are, you say, come on, who's going to accept that? Who's going to accept that the Christians are doing all this evil stuff inside the church when you see how they are outside the church? They're loving. They're gentle. You know, a lot of Egyptians, or a lot of Copts in Egypt, they get hired to be accountants by people of the opposite religion because they say what? You can trust them. You can trust them. That's how it's known, and that's how they're perceived, is that they're not like everybody else. So that when they speak evil of Christians and say, oh, you know what they do? And you say, really? I've never seen one of them. I've never seen one Christian, you know, like go up and punch somebody. Never seen anybody like go and steal money. Or, so that when they speak of you as evildoers, no one's going to believe. Is that how we are? There's places in the world that's how Christians are perceived. Is that nobody can speak evil of them because they see their conduct. There's no denying. Come on, who are you going to fool? Other people maybe, but not the Christians. That's exactly what St. Peter's saying. That by your good works which they observe, they would glorify God on the day of visitation. He says, look, because you're sojourners, you're here for a reason. That people would know God. You can't preach. And that's how mission is done in a lot of Middle Eastern countries or in China. You can't just openly preach, but they watch the life of Christ in the lives of the believers. And that's exactly what St. Peter is calling them to do. That they would glorify God in the day that God visits them with His grace. 13. Therefore, what do you ask when you see the word therefore in the Bible? We said this last week. What's the therefore, okay? Anytime you see the word therefore, you say, why is the therefore there? So what's the therefore? Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. All right. He says, submit to kings for the Lord's sake. Why do we submit to, you have to understand, you're thinking, okay, submit to the U.S. government, you know, pay your taxes. Okay. I want you to think, who was the king at the time? You guys remember who I said the king was in the beginning, first chapter? Emperor who? Nero, the guy that is taking Christians and lighting them as light posts in the street. You know what he says? He says, I want you to submit and surrender to them. Why? Why would you do that? He's saying, not for any other reason other than for the Lord's sake. For the Lord's sake. What would you do for the Lord's sake? How much would you be willing to endure and live in a way that might be like, who cares what Nero says? Let's revolt. You know why? You're going to find later on that it even talks about like servants and slaves. You're like, why does the Bible, St. Paul and St. Peter, keep talking about slaves as if they don't ever say like it's wrong? St. Peter and St. Paul never talk about slavery as it being wrong. We'll get into that. But I want you to think about this for a second. What did Jesus say about Caesar? He says what? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We have to give them our reputation. We are called to live as faithful to the highest degree with the laws of the land. A lot of us as Christians will say, oh, we're sons of God. Who cares about speeding? Or who cares about, like, why should I pay taxes to the government that is supporting God knows what? Why should I pay taxes? Let me cheat on my taxes. What would happen if one day it was discovered that Christians, God forbid, cheat on their taxes? You'd say, these people aren't loyal to our country. These people are living according to some other standard. They're not like us in a bad way, not in a good way. They feel like they're above the law. And sometimes that is kind of what we do, because this is our testimony. He's saying, I want your testimony as Christians, not for your sake, but for whose sake? For God's sake. That God's name would be exalted. It says what? Sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. One time when Pope Kyrillos went to go meet Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was a very, very evil, not evil, but at the time he was not a very good president towards the Christians. And he went into, Pope Kyrillos went to go ask for something for one of the churches, and he met Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he treated him like terribly. He says, you know, he's walking in, Sayyid is walking in, Pope Kyrillos is walking with his staff, and he says, what is he coming here to, like play with dogs with his stick? Basically, treat him very disrespectfully. So Pope Kyrillos kind of left very upset, and he says, okay, I'm not going to deal with you. Then Gamal Abdel Nasser got sick, his daughter got sick, and they said, you know, it's because of what you did to Pope Kyrillos. So they called Pope Kyrillos came, prayed for the daughter, she was healed. And then, Pope Kyrillos ended up kissing the hand of the president. He says, like, the way I treated you was poor. Why are you kissing my hand? No, I think he kissed his heart. Because it says, he kissed his chest when he went to lean in, he kissed his chest. In Proverbs 21, it talks about the heart of the king is in the hand of God. Imagine, the evil president that is treating the Christians poorly and, you know, taking away all the rights and treated Pope Kyrillos like he was like a dog. He went and he kissed his chest, his heart. He says, why are you doing that? He says, because your heart is in the hand of God. This was the mind. All of a sudden, the respect of the president towards Pope Kyrillos changed. He ended up giving permits to build the cathedral and money and all these things so that the cathedral could be built. Why? Because he could show this like subordinates to the king. He was honoring the king. Verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice. What is he saying? He's saying our freedom in Christ doesn't allow us just to live however we want. He says, no, don't use your freedom as a cloak for vice. Christian freedom does not mean being free to do what we like, but it means being free to do as we're supposed to do. It means you are set free to do what is right. You are empowered, you are set free from the control of Satan to actually fulfill the law of God. You are no longer under the control of sin. You're no longer under the control of the devil. No, you're set free, but not set free to live your own way. To set free to what? To live as you ought. St. Augustine said, love God and do what you like. He says, if you truly honor God and you love God, do whatever you want, because it's going to always be within line of the emperors and the kings. Well, what happens when the kings begin to ask the Christians to do something wrong? Do we fulfill this verse? What do you think? Clearly Nero was an evil person. What did the apostles say when they started? They said, do not preach in this name. What did they say? Should we what? We should obey God rather than men. He said, there's limits. If it means that we would disobey God, no. But on all other things, if we're not disobeying God, we have to submit to our king, or the king, president, whatever you want to call it. Verse 17, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Again, He's trying to take the mind of the Christian and say, no, no, no. It's not just like, okay, we have our own nizam, we do our own thing and forget everybody else. He says, no, honor all people. Why? Why honor all people? What is the view of a Christian towards all people? And why? How does Jesus see all people? What is the value of every person? If you were to equate the value of every person to be dealt with, what is their value equal to? The blood of the Son of God. When he says honor all people, I want you to ascribe value and worth to every single person. You say like who? Like Nero and his soldiers and his evil people. He says, you know what? They're actually worth the blood of the Son of God. They are equal to the value of the blood of Jesus. You say, well, you know, sometimes when we're persecuted, we look to the people that are persecuting us and we say like, may God strike them down and may God punish them and let them. What does the Bible say? It says, no, honor all people. Even those people, you know what their value is? You know what their worth is? The blood of the Son of God. Your boss, your corrupt manager, your neighbor that doesn't want to, his leaves keep on falling on your lawn, whatever, that person, you have to honor them because of their worth. It's not something simple. There's people in your life you would consider pathetic, but their value is equal to the blood of the Son of God. Now love the brotherhood. What does he say love the brotherhood? Who's the brotherhood? What would make you a brother unless you had the same father? We have the same father. So two people, let's say I can't forgive so-and-so. This person hurt me. I can't love them. After what they've done, I have nothing to do with them. But if you lose them as your brother, you know what you're doing is you're losing what? You're losing a father too. So you have to be careful. The person that you are choosing to not love as your brother, chances are you're also losing God as your father. Because you can't possibly love God and hate your brother like St. John says. You can't. So he says, love the brotherhood. Fear God. What is fear God? I talked about this before. It doesn't mean that we're deathly afraid of God, that He's going to strike me with lightning. It's to dread, to hate, to bring pain to the heart of God. And if you grow in holiness, if you want to measure growing in holiness, it's how much fear of God you have. Fear of God not meaning I have to pray all the time, that's part of it, but fear of God meaning what? Honoring the king, loving the brotherhood, loving my enemies. Unfortunately, that's what it means. To fear God means to fulfill the commandments. And if you want to grow in holiness, you have to grow in fear in God. Well, they say perfect love casts out fear. So I, at one point, had a very close, I have close relationships with like priests and bishops. And I can get used to them because they're my friend, but I can't forget that what? They still have like a prestige to them as a priest or as a bishop or whatever they are. And just because I love them doesn't mean I lose my reverence towards them. It's the same thing for God. Sometimes we get used to God. God is sweet, God is gentle, God is nice, and God is never going to get mad at me. We have to fear Him because He's a holy God. In verse 18. And then it says, honor the king, like we talked about. This is none other than Nero. None other than Nero. I want to read a passage. It's an early church document of how somebody was, it's called the letter to Diognetus. And they're describing Christians at the time in the early church. I'm going to listen to this. It says, to speak in general terms, we may say that a Christian is to the world what the soul is to the body. As the soul is present in every part of the body while remaining distinct from it, so Christians are found in all the cities of the world, but cannot be identified with the world. As the visible body contains the invisible soul, so Christians are seen living in the world, but their religious life remains unseen. The body hates the soul and wars against it, not because of any injury the soul has done it, but because of the restriction the soul places on its pleasures. Similarly, the world hates the Christians, not because they have done it any wrong, but because they are opposed to its enjoyments. Christians love those who hate them, just as the soul loves the body and all its members, despite the body's hatred. It is by the soul enclosed within the body that the body is held together. And similarly, it is by the Christians, detained in the world as in a prison, that the world is held together. Wow. The world is held together by what? The presence of Christians. It says this, the soul, though immortal, has immortal dwelling place. And Christians also live for a time amidst perishable things, while awaiting the freedom from change and decay that will be theirs in heaven. As the soul benefits from the deprivation of food and drink, so Christians flourish under persecution. As the soul benefits from the deprivation of food and drink, so Christians flourish under persecution. Such is the Christian's lofty and divinely appointed function, from which he is not permitted to excuse himself. When they described Christians, they were just not from this world. All right. Then it says, from 18 to 25, we'll finish it real quick. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh, for this is commendable. If because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth? Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return? When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. So here he's talking about Christ, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that having died to sins might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but having now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So you have to understand something about the nature of slavery in the early church. There was as many as 600,000 slaves at that time. And so people were slaves. And slavery began by people becoming just prisoners of war. And they weren't just normal, like, foolish tasks of cleaning bathrooms. You could be a doctor and a slave. You could be, a carpenter and be a slave. So the people, there was many people that became slaves. Even musicians and actors were slaves. All the work of Rome was done by slaves. Every job that was done in Rome, they said, why should we have to struggle? Get all of these, there's anywhere from 600,000, it grew to 1 million. When you have 1 million slaves, they say, why should any one of us Romans have to do any work? Hey, Christian, come here and do this for me. Even Christ says, if somebody asks you to what? Go with them 1 mile, do what? Go with them? Do you know why? It was the Roman law that a Roman could ask a Jew at the time of Jesus to walk with them and carry their stuff for 1 mile, and they couldn't argue. He says, but if you go with them a 2nd mile, it's no longer out of obligation, but it's out of what? It's out of love. And so here he's saying, he says, be submissive to masters. Imagine if they would have encouraged the slaves to rise against their masters. What would be the view of Christians of all time? They'd say what? Christians are troublemakers. You got to watch out for those Christians. They're going to get together and they can overthrow. They can cause war. They can do... He says, no, but by practicing the virtues, I want you to see that you could be set free by the virtues. Not be set free by, releasing yourself from slaves. Peter was concerned that Christian slaves should demonstrate to the world that their Christianity did not make them rebels. Their Christianity made them like God. Your Christianity doesn't make you like different than everybody else where you could just live your own life. No, it makes you live like Christ. And he wanted to make sure that we don't think that just the slaves can just turn over anything and just start to set themselves free. He says, no, stay in this position. Because if there's hundreds of thousands in every home, all they're going to do is shine. But you say, well, the slaves are suffering like unjustly. He says, if you suffer for your faults, for doing something wrong, what's the big deal? He says, who cares? He says, but if you suffer wrongfully, and then you do it, says it's commendable before God. You know why? He says, because the rest of the passage talks about everything that Jesus was. He says, if you take it patiently, then you're like Jesus. He says, Christ himself, who was God incarnate, didn't make himself any different. So I'm putting before you an example for you to live by. And he was talking about how he was reviled. He didn't revile in return. He suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. You see, when he talked to servants, he was talking to the greatest population of Christians. This one verse addressed more Christians in the world at that time than any other person. So it actually meant for you and me, we say, okay, how does this relate to us? But to them, this was every employee in Rome who was Christian was a slave. So if you're going to be a slave, I want you to live in this way. And he says, so that you could be just like Christ. Verse 25, it says, for you were like sheep going astray, but having now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. The word shepherd in the Jewish understanding, because of the way that the hills of like Judea were, like there had to always be shepherds amidst the sheep and like actively, closely looking after everyone, because they could easily fall off of cliffs, they could easily go astray, and like it was dangerous for them in this like geographical setting. And so it's understood that shepherds knew that you had to be extremely careful and watchful. It wasn't just that you sit there and you whistle and shh. I remember when we were in a safari in Kenya, and our car broke down. And so the guy was like looking to figure out how he was going to change the tire, and so we had to get out of the bus while he was, jacking up the car. And all of a sudden there was the Maasai tribe people, they're tribal people, and one of them is walking and he's whistling, and he has all these goats behind him, and they're all following his whistle. And as he says, he says, have you guys seen the lion? We're like, what lion? He says, oh yeah, we saw a lion here. Like now we're outside of the car in the safari park. And he says, oh yeah, we just saw a lion here. And he's there with his stick, and he's actively staying close as he whistles. The sheep stay close to him so that if one goes astray, it's at risk of being eaten by a lion. So a shepherd, Christ is saying, Christ understands Christ is your shepherd. He's not going to allow you to be devoured by a lion. And then he says, the overseer or the bishop or the episkopos of your soul. What does that mean? It was the person that was the protector. He was the guardian of your honor and your respect. Imagine. He's saying, Christ is the guarder of your honor. Christ is going to guard your honor in these difficult times. Stay faithful. Walk straight. He's the episkopos. To them it meant, like, God is not going to allow me to lose my dignity. Even though they were in very difficult times, he's saying, I want you to see him as the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. Glory be to God forever. Amen.